Hey guys, tonight we're heading deep into the rolling hills of Tennessee, back to the early 1800s, where forests pressed close against farmland and silence stretched wide over the countryside. The air here was heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth, broken only by the calls of whippoorwills echoing at dusk. It was a world still rough and unsettled, where the nights could feel so dark that even the bravest farmer might hesitate to step outside. The Bell family, having moved from North Carolina, built their lives in this quiet corner of Robertson County. A wide stretch of farmland, a simple home of timber and stone, and a life dictated by the rhythm of the seasons. They worked the soil by day, and at night gathered around flickering candles, the silence of the countryside wrapping itself around them. For many, this kind of isolation would have been peaceful, but here, it concealed something else, something restless, something waiting. You probably wouldn't survive long out here on your own, not with the woods pressing in, the wild animals roaming just beyond the fence, and though no one yet realized it, an unseen presence that had already taken notice of the Bell household. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight and what time it is for you as you listen. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The family lived quietly at first, their farm prospering in fertile soil. But peace is fragile in places like this. On certain nights, when the wind slowed and the world grew still, they began to notice faint disturbances, so subtle they almost dismissed them. A knock on the wall when no one was near, a faint scratching beneath the floorboards, little things that could be explained away by settling timber or scurrying mice. Yet the longer they lived there, the more undeniable it became that something unseen shared the home with them. At first, the noises seemed harmless, barely more than a curiosity whispered in the stillness of night. The Bells would lie in bed, their ears straining in the darkness as faint taps echoed from the wooden beams overhead. Sometimes it was a gentle scratching, as though tiny claws dragged across the floorboards, circling just beyond sight. Other times it was a dull thump against the wall, like a fist pressed from the other side, reminding them they were not as alone as they believed. The family tried to explain it away. Perhaps a squirrel had slipped into the rafters or a rat burrowed through the pantry. John Bell, ever the practical farmer, reassured his children with firm words, though even he found himself pausing in the silence, listening to the walls as if they had learned to breathe. Night after night the sounds returned, always after the lamps were extinguished, always when the house should have been at its quietest. The noises began to shift in tone. What once sounded like an animal scurrying now carried a rhythm, almost deliberate, like fingers drumming across a table. The children whispered to each other that it felt like someone trying to be heard. The youngest of them pressed close to their mother, their small voices trembling as they asked why the walls seemed to talk after dark. It wasn't only inside the house. Out in the yard, when the fields stretched pale under the moonlight, footsteps were sometimes heard crunching across the soil. Heavy, measured steps pacing near the fence line, circling the property, as though something unseen kept watch over the Bell farm. When lanterns were lit and the family rushed outside, the yard lay empty, silent, untouched. Only the chill in the air hinted at the presence that had already begun to tighten around them. Evening after evening, these sounds returned, louder, sharper, and more insistent. The Bells were no longer able to ignore them. Sleep grew restless, the children tossing and turning at every scratch and knock, their dreams interrupted by the sense that something waited just beyond the thin wooden walls. And deep down, they all began to feel it. This was not the work of animals or weather. Something else had stepped into their lives.
As the weeks turned into months, the Bell family grew accustomed to the nightly disturbances, though not in any way that brought comfort. Instead, it became a rhythm they dreaded. The scratching at twilight, the thuds in the rafters, the footsteps circling just outside. But then the haunting began to take form, shapes that lurked where no light should bend. One evening, while the fire burned low in the hearth, Lucy Bell noticed a shadow flit across the far wall. At first, she thought it was one of the children moving about, but when she turned, the entire room was still. The shadow had shifted on its own, gliding like smoke against the timber. She didn't speak of it at first, unwilling to frighten the children, but soon others saw the same. In the flickering candlelight, dark shapes moved where no one stood. Figures darted just beyond sight, slipping around corners, disappearing into walls. Sometimes, as John Bell pushed open a door, he swore he caught a silhouette waiting for him in the frame, only to find the room empty when he entered. The shadows were always faster than the eye, always half a heartbeat ahead. Objects in the home began to stir without warning. Chairs scraped across the floor in the dead of night, as though pulled by invisible hands. A heavy bed frame shifted inches across the room while the family sat awake, wide-eyed and clutching blankets against their chests. Small trinkets disappeared, only to be found later in strange places: the fireplace, the barn, even outside in the fields. Each act seemed deliberate, as though the presence within the house had grown bolder, feeding on the fear it provoked. One night, young Betsy sat by her candle trying to read before sleep. The flame flickered, sputtered, then bent sharply sideways, as though something exhaled against it. She gasped, dropping her book, and in that moment saw the unmistakable shape of a hand, shadowy and thin, stretching across her page. When she screamed, the others rushed in, only to find nothing but the lingering smell of damp earth and a chill that clung to the air long after the candle had gone out. By then, it was clear. Whatever haunted the Bell family had moved beyond mere noises. It had taken shape. It had learned how to touch their world, and it was no longer content to stay hidden.
The sounds, the shadows, the restless movements inside the home, each had carried its own terror. But nothing unsettled the Bell family as deeply as when the presence finally found its voice. It began quietly, almost like a whisper carried on the breeze. On certain nights, just as the house grew still, the children swore they heard faint murmurs drifting through the darkness. At first, it was impossible to tell what was being said. Just broken syllables, the low hum of something that should not have spoken at all. But the whispers grew clearer with each passing night. Soon, the voice began to call names. Betsy's name would slip through the darkened hallways, spoken in a tone that was neither kind nor cruel, but eerily familiar, as though spoken by someone who knew her well. Then came the mocking laughter, soft and hollow, echoing against the walls. It would rise in sudden bursts, startling the family awake, only to fade again, leaving behind a silence far heavier than before. The spirit was clever. It learned to mimic voices the Bells knew, repeating phrases in tones that sounded like neighbors or even family members. But the words it chose were sharp, taunting, designed to wound. It laughed at John Bell's struggles with his health. It whispered cruel promises into Betsy's ears. It mocked the family's prayers, repeating sacred lines in twisted cadences until even the faithful Lucy felt her faith tested.
More than once, the children would beg their parents not to leave them alone, for the voice always returned when the house was darkest and the lamps burned lowest. It spoke from the corners of rooms, from beneath beds, from the very walls themselves. Sometimes it felt as though it breathed against their necks. Other times it echoed from the rafters, filling the house with a presence too large to be contained by timber and stone. The neighbors, once skeptical, began to hear it too. Visitors who stayed the night found themselves shaken awake by a voice calling their names or laughter that bubbled up from nowhere. They left the house pale, unable to explain what they had experienced, but certain of one thing: the Bell farm was no ordinary place. For the Bells, each night became a test of endurance. Sleep was no longer a refuge, for even in dreams the voice followed them. It knew them. It studied them. And now it had made itself heard.
Of all the family members, none bore the weight of the haunting more heavily than young Betsy Bell. Sweet-natured, gentle, and barely entering her teenage years, she had once been the light of the household. But as the presence grew stronger, it turned its focus toward her with a cruelty that stunned everyone who witnessed it. At first, Betsy felt only the fear of being watched. The whispers seemed to curl around her most often, her name drawn out slowly in tones that made her shiver. When she lay in bed, she sometimes felt the sheets tug against her body, as though unseen fingers were testing their hold. Then came sharper touches, pinches against her arms, hair pulled suddenly in the dark. The family tried to soothe her, telling her it must be dreams or her imagination. But before long, the attacks became undeniable. Neighbors who came to the Bell house reported seeing Betsy struck by forces they could not explain. Red marks bloomed across her cheeks as though slapped by an invisible hand. Bruises appeared on her arms where no human fingers had touched her. Once, as she stood in prayer, her body convulsed violently, lifted and thrown to the ground by something no one else could see. Her screams echoed through the farm, piercing the night until her voice was raw. What frightened her most, though, were the words the spirit reserved for her. It taunted her about her future, mocking her affections for a young suitor in town. It whispered promises that she would never know peace, that her life would forever be shadowed by its presence. The cruelty carried a strange intelligence. This was not random malice, but targeted torment, as though the entity delighted in unraveling her spirit piece by piece. The community began to take notice. Betsy's suffering was too visible to ignore, and whispers spread through the town of a curse, of a child being tormented by something unholy. Clergymen who came to pray over her found their words drowned out by mocking laughter. Strong men who tried to intervene could do nothing but watch as her hair was pulled, her body shaken, her spirit driven toward despair. For Betsy, every night became a battle she could not win. Sleep brought no rest, daylight offered no relief. The haunting had found its favorite victim, and in her pain, the true depth of the Bell Witch's malice revealed itself. The more attention the entity received, the stronger it seemed to grow. What began as faint noises and shadowy movements had now become something intelligent, something that thrived on being noticed. The Bell Witch, though no one yet called it that, had learned to wield its voice like a weapon, and with each word, its reach stretched farther beyond the walls of the Bell home. It was not content to merely torment, it wanted to demonstrate its power. The spirit revealed knowledge it should never have possessed. During meals, it whispered secrets that left the family stunned. Details of private conversations held miles away, matters no outsider could possibly know. When neighbors gathered, the voice would expose their hidden shames, mocking them in tones that perfectly mimicked their own friends and relatives. Word spread through Robertson County of this strange phenomenon. Farmers and townsfolk, once skeptical, began to visit the Bell farm not only out of sympathy, but out of sheer curiosity. And when they came, the spirit greeted them as if it had been expecting their arrival. It called them by name before they introduced themselves. It spoke of events occurring far away, events later confirmed to be true. Some even swore it repeated sermons being delivered in churches across the county, word for word, while the preacher himself was miles from the farm. This uncanny knowledge unsettled even the most steadfast believers. Some thought it a trick of the devil. Others whispered it was the restless soul of someone wronged, returning to exact revenge. Whatever it was undeniably intelligent and undeniably aware. The Bell children grew increasingly withdrawn. Each time the entity displayed its knowledge, they felt the walls of their home closing tighter around them. Betsy, still its favorite target, was mocked relentlessly, the voice predicting tragedies yet to come in her life. Lucy Bell clung to her faith, praying aloud for protection, only to be met with laughter that rattled the windows and shook the floorboards beneath her knees. The farm itself seemed to take on a strange energy. Animals grew restless at night, refusing to settle. Horses snorted and kicked their stalls as though some unseen hand moved through the barn. Even the crops seemed uneasy, the fields unusually still beneath the moonlight, as if nature itself was listening to the whispers that spilled from the Bell household. And yet, as terrifying as it was, people kept coming. They wanted to hear the voice. They wanted to witness the impossible. The haunting had become more than a family's private torment. It was now a spectacle, a legend unfolding in real time. And with each audience, the spirit only grew stronger, feeding on the fear and fascination of all who dared to draw near. By the time the Bell Witch had made its presence undeniable, the quiet farmstead had become something closer to a gathering place. Word spread quickly through the county, and then far beyond it. Neighbors, friends, strangers, and even prominent men of faith began making the trip to Robertson County, each hoping to witness the haunting with their own eyes, or perhaps with their own ears. Visitors were rarely disappointed. On many nights, as the family sat nervously in their parlor, the spirit announced the arrival of guests before they even reached the door. By the time a knock rattled against the wood, the voice had already spoken their name, leaving the family and visitors alike shaken. Clergymen came, armed with prayer and scripture, determined to drive out the presence. They prayed with conviction, raising their voices above the eerie laughter that rippled through the house. But when their words were finished, the spirit mocked them, sometimes repeating their prayers back in a twisted sing-song voice, other times ridiculing their faith outright. One minister left pale and trembling, admitting quietly that what he had faced in the Bell home was beyond the strength of mortal men. Curious travelers stopped as well, some from counties far away. They came skeptically, expecting rumors and exaggeration. Yet many departed with trembling hands and wide eyes, speaking of invisible hands tugging their coats or voices whispering their deepest secrets aloud. Some swore they felt unseen fingers trace across their arms, cold and deliberate, as if the spirit wished to remind them it could touch whomever it pleased. For the Bells, the constant influx of visitors was a double-edged sword. Their suffering was no longer private, but laid bare for strangers to examine. And yet the witnesses served a strange purpose. They confirmed the family's torment.
No one could accuse them of madness now, not when dozens had heard the laughter, the voices, the cruel taunts echoing in the empty rooms. Stories spread further. Some claimed the entity could carry on conversations, holding debates with visitors deep into the night. Others swore it could mimic any voice perfectly, making it impossible to tell if they were speaking to the spirit or to one of their companions. Each tale added to the growing legend, painting the Bell Farm not just as a haunted house, but as the stage for something the world had never quite seen before. And while many came as skeptics, few left without some trace of unease, for the voice that drifted through those halls seemed to know everyone it touched, and once it knew you, it never seemed to forget.
Though the Bell Witch tormented the entire family, it soon became clear that its deepest hatred was reserved for one man, John Bell, the patriarch of the household. From the earliest whispers, the voice mocked him more harshly than the others, its tone shifting from mischievous to venomous whenever his name was spoken. John was a respected farmer, a man known for his work ethic and steady hand, but the presence within his home seemed determined to unravel him piece by piece. At first, it was only insults, cruel words murmured in the dark, laughter that rose from the shadows whenever he prayed aloud. But soon, the torment moved beyond words. John began suffering sudden, unexplained ailments. His jaw stiffened without warning, leaving him unable to speak or swallow for hours at a time. At meals, he sometimes found his tongue numb, his lips trembling as if struck by an unseen force. Neighbors noticed his once strong frame weakening, his movements slower, his shoulders sagging under a weight no one else could see. The voice took pleasure in his decline. It mocked him openly, telling the family it was its sworn enemy, that his end would be slow and inevitable. Whenever he tried to join in prayers, the spirit interrupted, shouting over him until the words caught in his throat. Even outside, working in the fields, John felt the presence pressing close, as though the air around him carried the witch's scorn. The rest of the family watched helplessly as his health faltered. Lucy, his wife, begged the spirit for mercy, pleading in her soft, steady way. And strangely, the voice often spoke kindly to her, calling her a good woman, praising her character. But for John, there was no reprieve. The spirit had chosen him as its enemy, and each passing month revealed new layers of its cruelty. When visitors came to the farm, they too witnessed the torment. In the middle of conversations, John's face would twist, his words lost, as if his mouth had been bound by invisible cords. The spirit would laugh at him, declaring that it would see him ruined. Some nights, his body convulsed with seizures that no doctor could explain, leaving him weak and shaken for hours. It was as though the Bell Witch fed on his suffering, growing stronger as he grew weaker. The farm continued to draw curious onlookers, but for John Bell, the days of tending his fields and guiding his family with steady hands were fading fast. The presence that haunted his home was relentless, and it had made a chilling promise. His end was coming.
The torment of John Bell stretched on for years, his health unraveling beneath the weight of the spirit's vow. What began as stiffness and trembling grew into full paralysis, his body betraying him more each day. And always the voice was there, waiting, mocking, reminding the family that its work was not yet finished. It did not hide its intentions. The Bell Witch declared openly, before family and visitors alike, that John Bell would die by its hand. The words chilled everyone who heard them, yet the voice carried such certainty, such grim conviction, that none could dismiss it as mere boasting. The haunting had already defied all reason. Why should this promise be any different? By the winter of 1820, John was frail and bedridden, his once commanding presence reduced to quiet groans and shallow breaths. The family gathered close, praying, hoping, though each prayer was punctuated by the sound of cruel laughter rippling through the air. Then, one cold December morning, they discovered a small vial of strange dark liquid in the cupboard. None of them recognized it. When they asked the spirit what it was, the voice answered with chilling glee, it was poison. Not long after, John slipped into unconsciousness. His breathing grew ragged, uneven, until, at last, he was gone. As the family wept, the mocking voice rang out in triumph. It claimed responsibility for his death, its laughter echoing through the house in what sounded less like victory and more like a warning that the power it held was real and absolute. At the funeral, attended by neighbors and mourners from across the county, the spirit's presence did not rest. As prayers were offered and words of comfort spoken, it interrupted with cruel laughter, jeering at the grieving family, mocking the man who now lay buried in the cold Tennessee soil. The very air seemed heavy with its malice, as if John Bell's death had only strengthened its hold. For the Bells, there was no denying it now. The haunting had not been random cruelty nor idle torment. It had built toward this moment, this single outcome, the destruction of John Bell. And with his death, the line between the natural and the supernatural seemed thinner than ever, leaving all who had witnessed it shaken to their core.
One might expect the haunting to fade with John Bell's passing, its vow fulfilled, its purpose complete. But the spirit was not so easily satisfied. Though its cruelty had reached its peak with his death, the presence did not vanish. It lingered, restless as ever, refusing to release its grip on the Bell family. The nights still carried whispers. The mocking laughter still rose from the corners of darkened rooms. Betsy, already scarred by years of torment, found no relief. The voice continued to taunt her, speaking of her suitor, Joshua Gardner, and filling her with dread for the future. Each cruel word eroded her hope until she broke off their engagement, unable to imagine a life free of the witch's shadow. Neighbors still reported strange disturbances when visiting the farm. Knocks rattled the walls, footsteps echoed across empty floors, and voices rose in conversations no human tongue had spoken. Some nights, the spirit carried on debates with visitors, weaving scripture and mockery together in a display of both intelligence and malice. Others swore they heard it singing in the darkness, songs no one recognized, haunting melodies that left listeners uneasy long after they ended. And yet, there were moments of strange contradiction. The entity sometimes spoke kindly to Lucy Bell, offering blessings over her and her children. It even predicted the outcome of local events with eerie accuracy, lending an air of prophecy to its whispers. But for every word of comfort, there were 10 of cruelty, and the family never truly knew where they stood in the shifting temperament of their unseen guest. Over time, the intensity waned, though never completely. The spirit's voice grew less frequent, its appearances less dramatic, but it was never gone. It lingered in the stillness, in the uneasy silence after dark, as if waiting for the right moment to return in full. The Bells continued their lives, but the mark of the haunting never left them. Their neighbors, their friends, even strangers passing through all knew the truth. The Bell farm was not like other places. It had been touched by something that defied explanation, and once touched, it could never return to peace.
The Bell Witch had claimed her enemy, but her story was far from finished.
As years passed, the Bell Witch transformed from a family's torment into a legend whispered across Tennessee. Travelers carried the tale far beyond Robertson County, repeating the strange details of voices in the dark, of unseen hands striking young Betsy, of John Bell's death foretold and fulfilled. Each retelling seemed to add weight until the Bell Witch was no longer just a haunting, it was a piece of living folklore. Some stories claimed the entity vanished entirely after John Bell's death. Others insisted it promised to return. And in time, some swore it did. A handful of locals reported new disturbances, faint voices carried on the night air, shadowy figures glimpsed along the old Bell property. Generations after the original haunting, people claimed to hear echoes of the witch near a cave on the land, a place that became tied inseparably to the legend. The cave, dark and damp, with its winding passages beneath the hills, was said to be a place where the spirit still moved freely, waiting for anyone brave or foolish enough to disturb it. Families who lived nearby spoke in hushed tones about odd sounds drifting from the woods, or of children hearing whispers when they played too close to the riverbank. Hunters swore they saw shapes moving among the trees, vanishing when followed. Though skeptics dismissed these tales as superstition, too many accounts lingered, repeated by too many lips, to fade entirely into disbelief. The Bell Witch became a kind of cautionary tale. Parents warned children not to wander after dark, lest they cross her path. Storytellers around campfires spoke of the spirit as if it might arrive the moment her name was spoken. And through it all, the memory of the Bell family's suffering anchored the legend in something more solid than rumor. After all, dozens of witnesses had seen it, heard it, even felt it. This was no ordinary ghost story passed in whispers. It was something that had shaken an entire community, leaving a mark that never quite healed. Even now, the Bell Witch endures as one of America's most infamous hauntings, her tale carried across centuries. The boundaries between fact and legend may blur, but the echoes remain, threaded through time like the faintest whisper in the night, reminding us that some stories are too deeply rooted to ever be silenced.
Time has a way of softening the edges of memory, yet the Bell Witch remains, her legend stitched into the fabric of Tennessee's past. The farm, once filled with laughter and labor, became a place of hushed voices and uneasy glances. Even as the decades slipped away, the whispers did not vanish entirely. They seemed to linger, like the echo of footsteps long after the walker has gone. Visitors to the land sometimes spoke of a hush that fell suddenly over the fields, as though the earth itself paused to listen. Others claimed to feel a presence while standing in the shadow of the old Bell home, a cool weight that pressed lightly against the skin, neither seen nor named. And in the cave, carved deep into the hillside, those brave enough to enter swore they heard the faintest of sounds, a woman's voice, soft, mocking, just beyond the curve of the stone walls. The Bell Witch had taken her vengeance, had carved her mark in fear and sorrow, yet she was never bound to one moment in time. Instead, she slipped into story, into song, into the spoken words of each generation that repeated her name. And in that way, she was never truly gone. The legend endures not because of shadows or voices alone, but because of what they left behind. The reminder that even in the most ordinary of places, mystery can take root. A quiet farm, a family seeking peace, and the sudden intrusion of something vast and unseen, bending their world into one of terror and wonder. Perhaps that is why the Bell Witch still unsettles us, not because she was heard or even seen, but because she seemed to know us, our secrets, our fears, our fragile hopes. And perhaps even now, her whispers drift through the night, searching for ears willing to listen. So, as the story slows, let your thoughts soften with it. Imagine the Tennessee hills rolling gently into the distance, the hush of twilight settling across the fields. Picture the old farmhouse now empty, the shadows stretching long across its wooden beams, carrying no voices but the sigh of the wind. Let it all blur and fade like the quiet closing of a book at the end of a long night. And as you breathe deeper, slower, let the edges of the story dissolve into silence. Nothing stirs, nothing lingers, only stillness remains. The Bell Witch drifts into memory, and you drift into rest. Sleep well.